Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we will be going over Revenant, and first things first, let's go into the builds. So with Revenant, I do have multiple builds, but they all do the same thing. The first build is a pillage build, opting for a full armor strip, as Revenant is running super high strength anyway across all of his builds, so there's absolutely no downside to running pillage. In fact, with Revenant, you're running so much strength that even with just growing power and molt augmented, you already have enough strength to full strip the enemies, meaning that your focus school is completely irrelevant when it comes to your strength for pillage. Another thing is you don't need arcane energize, just equilibrium and prime flow is enough. So you can use a DPS arcane, and if you're using something that you can use arcane rise, such as the Tonkor or the Tetra or anything like that, Arcane Rise is a very nice DPS increase. Do note that the Brahma does not work with Arcane Rise. The second build was just a standard roar build with even higher strength. Energy conversion, all of our buffs, we have roughly 500% strength for a 150% strength roar. A high strength roar is good, who knew? And as for the final standard build, this was, in my opinion, by far the worst one. So this build was using Mind Control to make use of Thrall Pact and Revenant's 1. At first, I thought that this build would be interesting and more fun to play than the rest, but I was wrong. It was actually more boring than the other two builds. The reason for this is because I thought that Mind Control and Enthrall would be like a fun little combo, but it really isn't. It's just something that you do like once a minute, and the abilities kind of play themselves. So you'll just mind control an enemy, enthrall them, and then for the next minute, the mind controlled enemy will just constantly enthrall, so you're really not doing anything yourself, it's all automated. So it was just boring. It also wasn't as good as the other two builds either, as Thrall Pact is not actually as big of a DPS increase as full stripping the enemies or Roar is. You also lose a mod slot as you really want duration. The final build is a Granum Void build, as I believe that Revenant is by far the best Warframe in the entire game for doing Granum Void. It is very simple, very easy. It doesn't require much setup at all. You can even do it with a Revenant that doesn't even have a reactor. You just have to use some energy pads. As for the rest of the kit, primary is of course your AoE weapon of choice. Tonkor works very well with the Arcane Rise, which is why I was using this. Secondary is your primer of choice. I was using the Compressa for the Roar build to instantly strip 90% of their armor with corrosive and heat procs. Compressa can also deal with nullifier bubbles. If you just want a primer and you don't care about stripping their armor with corrosive, then the Nucor also works, and this also deals with nullifiers, or the Epitaph for just a raw primer. As for your melee, it is whatever melee you want. I was using the Glaive for the extra burst damage. Alternatively, you could use the Praetos or the Enidem for the passive stats that they provide. As for the focus school, with Revenant, it really doesn't matter for any build. Any of these focus schools work, so if you find yourself needing more energy for some reason, go Zeneric. If you want to use your melee a lot, you can use Naramon to keep your combo, and Lethal Levitation for 200% extra damage. Madurai, of course, for 40% extra ability strength, and Void Strike, always good. Unaru for access to an armor strip if you're going the full strip build. And Vazarin if you would want to use Vazarin for God knows what. Anything that you do on Revenant focus school wise works, and whatever you choose won't impact your build in any meaningful way. As for the last thing, it is just a standard Panzer build with the synth mods equipped. And now moving on to the rankings, we will be discussing Revenant in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, his survivability, secondly, his KPM, thirdly, his viability, and finally, how fun he is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path mod run with no specters and no on-call. We will be starting with Revenant's survivability firstly today. So, to begin, Revenant survivability is pretty straightforward. Revenant is by far the tankiest Warframe in the entire game. His 2 makes him completely invincible. The only thing that can kill him is getting nullified, dying to violence or misery if you're not paying attention, or if you're so bored because he's so easy to play that you just stop paying attention, let your Mesmer Skin run out, and you die. Another easy way to die as Revenant is you press Mesmer Skin and then you go to get your Hot Pocket, and whenever you're out getting your Hot Pocket, you also decide to take your dog for a walk, maybe go to the bathroom yourself, come back, and then you realize that you forgot to pause, and by then you might only have 1 or 2 Mesmer Skin stacks left, so you might die. No, but seriously, Revenant is invincible. If you die as Revenant ever, it is 100% your fault, and you really should not be dying as Revenant, especially as a regular occurrence. Revenant actually has such good survivability, I am going to give Revenant his own rank of Revenant. It is 1 tier above S+. This ties into the second topic, of course, Revenant's KPM. And on paper, Revenant should have roughly similar KPM to Rhino, as Rhino and Revenant are very similar. They are just extremely tanky Warframes that have damage buffs. However, Rhino has the opportunity to run Roar and another damage buff, whereas Revenant either decides to run Roar or he gets to run something like an armor strip like Terrify or Pillage. Rhino can run both, so theoretically Rhino actually scales better with his KPM. But in actuality, if you're not talking about like level 1000 plus enemies, Revenant actually has better KPM than Rhino just because his survivability is so minimal effort. You press a button and you're invincible for upwards of a minute, if not longer. So you never have to worry about keeping yourself alive. You're just sitting there killing enemies with either an armor strip or a damage buff. And since you don't have to worry about keeping yourself alive and you're just non-stop killing enemies, you actually get a higher KPM than Rhino until the later levels where having an armor strip and a damage buff both would be beneficial because the enemies are so tanky. But again, that's only when the enemies are like level 1 to 2000 that will ever be relevant. So because of this, I will give Revenant an A rank for his KPM. Now, moving on to the third topic, Revenant's Viability. And this is where Revenant kind of falls off because, yes, you're super tanky, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're a good Warframe. If you're good at the game, you can survive on any frame up until level cap. You don't have to be invincible just to do that. So him just being extremely tanky doesn't suddenly make him really good. However, Revenant is good if you're just trying to play the game as a tool to socialize with other people and you don't really feel like putting forth effort into the game itself. Then it is very nice just to play Revenant and chill and not have to worry about actual gameplay. Another thing that Revenant is really, really good for is if you're just getting into Steel Path or you're trying to do your first level cap run, he is by far the easiest Warframe in the entire game to do those things as. The only alternative that's just as easy is playing an invis frame such as Ash if you're doing like a disruption, or Octavia if you're doing like a survival. Those are the only frames that rival Revenant's ease of use and his beginner friendliness. Another thing that Revenant is good for, I briefly mentioned this at the start of the video, he is, in my opinion, by far the best Warframe in the game to spawn sisters as, because he makes Granum Void a complete joke. All you do is you want to be slightly elevated, either on a rock or just like slightly elevated off the ground, and then you just press 4 and you can actually go AFK as long as you Mesmer Skin beforehand. Hell, even half the time you don't even have to Mesmer Skin because you're just nuking them. He's very consistent, 30-second Granum Voids, absolutely no effort, so he's really, really good for that. But outside of these 3 situations, like sister farming, or just doing sisters or liches in general, or you're just learning the game, or you don't feel like putting forth the effort in that game, there's not really a place where Revenant actually is useful at. So I will give Revenant a B rank for his viability and leave it at that. And now moving on to the final topic, how fun is Revenant? And this is where I think he really falls off, and as I've mentioned, he's really good if you're trying to just turn your brain off and not actually have to put forth effort in the game. That inherently makes him not that fun of a Warframe to play, and I unfortunately couldn't find a way to actually make him interesting. I tried a nuke build with his 4. Like I said, I tried the mind control build, but it was honestly even more boring than using roar or pillage, as you had to press abilities even less often, and the game kind of just played itself. So he's just a gun frame that doesn't have to worry about survivability whatsoever, so you kind of find yourself just dozing off while playing him, and I really did not enjoy myself at all. However, I understand that this is polarizing, as some people will probably find him extremely fun because that they don't really have to try. However, I believe that most people will find him to be very boring, but since I am aware that it is polarizing and some people will really like him, I will just give him an average fun rank of C+. In conclusion, Revenant is a solid A-tier Warframe who is very good for players who are trying to ease themselves into higher level content such as Sisters, Liches, Steel Path, or even level cap. However, he has the downside that the only thing that he's truly useful for is his ease of use and his extreme tankiness. Once you learn how to survive his other Warframes, his overall viability greatly falls off.